Hello, I'm Tommy Moore from the Bartitsu Lab, and in this video I'll be breaking down my top 5 weapons, or my top 5 weapon recommendations for you to get yourself familiar with and to safeguard yourself against. Many people, when they're looking to understand weapons themselves, they'll look immediately to, say, a Filipino art or an Indonesian art. And one of the problems I find with that is a lot of the weapon archetypes in those forms are not necessarily familiar with things that we get attacked with in the Western world. So for example, training with a perfectly even eskrima stick doesn't necessarily reflect the type of things that you might be attacked with in the Western world. The same with the types of knives. You're very unlikely to be attacked with something held in a karambit fashion or karambit shaped, and you're very unlikely to be attacked with a very long kind of barong style blade. So there are different archetypes, and whilst weapons are archetypes, and if you're good with a stick and you're good with a knife, you should be able to pick up and understand and flow with concepts ubiquitously. I wanted to really hone down on some of the very common archetypes of tools and weapons you might fight and how to get familiar with them in a combative sense. So I'll move my way through my top 5 recommendations for your weapon familiarization. The first, and I think one that we typically look at the least in combatives and martial arts, is the use of utility blades. Because a utility blade often has characteristics and movements which are not the same as your average knife. A utility blade often, and this is quite a large one, this is probably as large as they come, most utility blades have a very small profile. So often in some people's hands you can't see that blade. Some of the disarms that you might look at when it comes to a knife and some of the knife strips will not perform on a Stanley blade because all that sticks out is the horrible nasty end. It's primarily a slashing tool, although it can thrust and penetrate, it's primarily slashing, and its primary targets are going to be the hands, the face and the neck, so the maxillofacial area and the hands. Any decent level of clothing will prevent this causing much mischief, but your hands, your face and your neck are very, very vulnerable. They're very easy to hide, they have a very low profile, they can be hidden and drawn very quickly, and often you might not know this is in play until the last minute. These are a ubiquitous terror sidearm. They're essentially the terror sidearm of choice. Many modern terror attacks have had these as a secondary or a tertiary weapon. If you look at the Paris attacks, you look at 9/11, you look at lots of terror attacks, a utility knife is often a very common secondary or tertiary tool. So it's something you need to be aware of. It also has a wicked articulation, that if you grab or try and control this, it's very easy to bring this to bear on the grabbing hand when compared to especially somewhat larger knives. It's very easy to wheedle, I love that word, this into horrible nasty places even at a very close range grapple because it's got a very small turning circle, so it can turn very nasty for you even at where you think you've got a solid grapple, where you think you've got a solid 2-on-1. It can really start to mince and mash your arm up just because of the ease of the articulation. And the angles of this tend to be very unpredictable and can flow and move in ways which you wouldn't typically see manifest in a larger knife. So I'd say pay some attention to looking at the attributes, the ways in which these are used, how they have been used against people, and what you might do about it. Second, and one I'll probably spend the least amount of time on, will be your everyday folder. So we've looked at utility, Stanley craft knives, very common. Then you've got typical kind of folding knife of between 2 and 4 inches. So 2 and 4 inches, this is the most common street theft, street assault type of knife. It's easy to conceal, it's easy to hold away, obviously because of its foldability. It's easy to dispose of if you're being searched, it's easy to get rid of. It's got pretty decent thrusting capabilities. The cuts of these, a bit like the Stanley knife, this will not cut through anything with solid cloth or solid leather or a decent bit of clothing. What it will do is take out good chunks of face and throat, and again hands. So face, throat, hands are some very common areas for cuts. For thrusts, this is a primary use of this tool. And again, the thrusts are often very unpredictable, often sewing machined in, most commonly in the Western world held in a forehand position, and most commonly in the Western world preceded by a push, a grab or other off balancing, followed up by repeated 12 to 6 clock face strikes. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Working the way up with the right hand predominant. These are things that we see, or immediate thrusts down that 6-12 line. So this is something we need to be aware of. Again, like the craft blade, they're easy to hide, easy to cup, easy to dispose of. Very rarely are they used in this format in the Western world. So again, devoting your training to the most common grip and the most common attacks is very, very important for the things that you'll face. Then you move your way through, so a knife for terror. This is often a knife for crime. This is a knife for crime and terror. Often a larger blade, so a fixed blade of between 4 and 8 inches, a carving knife. This is a very ubiquitous weapon for mass terror. Criminals often don't want to get caught, and that's why this makes a lot more sense. I can hide, dispose of, and essentially cover this very easily. This, if I'm getting out of my truck, which I've just ploughed into a load of people, this is fuck you, I don't care if I get caught, but I'm going to stab up as many people as I possibly can in a short period of time. So it's a spree killing tool. Now with these, obviously fixed blade, most carving knives have very poor cutting or slashing ability. Again, they're stopped by quite even relatively thin clothing. And this is a very high quality cleaver, like a kind of machete or kind of a Chinese cooking knife. Most people, however, they'll have things like this, and the access for the lay terror person will be something like this. So when the carving knife has a wicked thrust to it, causes massive penetration. You imagine your heart being here, at any angle, it's got a lot of access to the heart. The penetration is very, very easy. It can get in very, very quickly, let alone any of the other vascular and arterial routes around your body. So it's a nasty, wicked weapon, long on the thrust, which means you can't take very many of these, not at all, because they're likely to shred through something very important. The cuts on these, to the face, throat, hands, again, will be common, but the thrust is what you need to worry about with these longer tools. And with these longer tools, some of your more Asian ballistic strips and other things might come in useful. And again, I find, myself anyway, grappling against a larger blade is much easier than grappling against a shorter street blade or a utility. I can see where this is, so if you think in terms of OODA loop, I can observe and orientate myself towards this much easier than I can following this little bastard, okay? So again, a carving knife, a ubiquitous weapon of terror, typically between 6 and 8 inches, something like that. Typically poor on the cut, wicked on the thrust. Also watch out for how this is being held. Has there adhesive been applied? Has a tape been applied? Again, this is becoming increasingly common to stop them being disarmed. So some of the things you want to watch out for is the type and nature of the blade, how long it is, what kind of attributes does it have? Has it been affixed? Because if it's been affixed to the hand, some of the things that you might choose to do will be different than whether it's not affixed. So again, looking at the top of the tree here, this will cause maximum death in the shortest possible time because of its sheer length and force. It will find its way into places that are bad for you. But again, beware of how these are used, what motions they're used in. Is it affixed? Is it not? And again, an important training tool. So when we're training with military style knives or Filipino style knives, they don't necessarily reflect the characteristics of your average cooking or carving knife. But these make up a far greater proportion of assaults and acts of terror than your typical commando, or what we call in the UK, weirdly, zombie knives. Any of those novelty knives, military knives, they don't make up a mainstay. These things do. So street knives are relatively ubiquitous, but more criminal orientated, more terror orientated, or those that are very disturbed. But again, as a weapon of terror, very, very common. These somewhere in the middle. When you look at blunts, you see a lot of people and they think they've nailed blunt weapons because they've trained in stick. But the problem is that the vast majority of street crime with a blunt is often with a weighted end weapon. Now I'm using a hammer here because they're very ubiquitous, a lot of home assault. Again, for someone looking to do a burglary, a robbery, this is an important tool to have. Smashing doors, smashing windows. This is a utility tool and a weapon. So again, for criminal elements, very, very common. But even with things such as bats, typically a rounder's bat, so a small baseball bat or a full-size baseball bat, or indeed a wrench or some type of socket or ratchet, these types of things will typically have one end heavier than the other end. So most blunt weapons of assault are actually top-weighted, a top-weighted tool. You think about things like koshes, saps and the like, those are all top-weighted. Weapons which are tools, you think of like a crowbar, you think of a hammer, top-weighted. You think of most common bats, small or large, top weighted. So it's important to get used to how does a top weighted weapon move differently than an even stick. An even stick will have different ways of using it compared to hammer, axe, crowbar, wrench, those types of things. So again, if you're looking at training with and to defend yourself against blunt tools, one of your focus areas, I believe, should be in the weighted end variety, be it hammers, be it bats, things that have more mass at one end than another, because how they're moved, their recovery time, what they can do is often markedly different. Again, more often a criminal choice of weapon than a terror choice of weapon, but something you should get familiar with, and not something that necessarily translates from a stick. So if you're doing arts that cover stick, they don't necessarily translate well from stick to weighted end weapon. Often that is a bit of a learning curve. So understand and get familiar with other types of blunt weapon that may be more common or ubiquitous. And then finally, if we're looking at things that go bang in the night, especially in the Western world, if we're looking at terror-proofing ourselves, obviously America has its own concerns with weapons, and they're much more proliferate in their range, scale and types of weapon. But if you think of Europeans, you think of Australians, you think of other parts of the world that don't have such a gun culture, the nasty gun that you might come across is more than likely to be a weapon of serious organised crime or indeed terror. And for that, it is the ubiquitous AK model weapon. And again, it's important to familiarise yourself, even if you don't do much shooting. It's important to familiar yourself with how does the clip come out? How does this magazine exit this particular gun? Yep. So what does this little thing do? If I grab this, how easy is it to pull out? It's important to know that this end, if it's been fired, gets very, very, very wickedly hot. So with other weapons, you might be able to grab the muzzle. With this, it is wickedly hot. So if you are going to try and take this off someone, where do I grab it? What do I do? If I'm looking to take the mag off this, what do I do? What do I squeeze? If I do somehow get this off someone and I need to use it, I at least need to know the difference between safe, full auto and semi-auto. I need to know what this little gubbins does. Some of the things that you might not be familiar with are slings, watching out for slings. If I've got this around me, what does that mean for what I can do with this weapon? How far can I take it off the person? You know, this helps them retain that weapon. So again, if you need to do a counter weapon assault, are you looking out for slings? And are you aware of how differently this makes your attack? You know, what does this mean to you? And what does it mean to the type of offence you now may wish to employ? So again, if you look at a very common weapon, AK platform, very cheap copies of it all over North Africa, all over Eastern Europe, all over Asia, most bad places in the world, but this is a tool of choice in slightly more modern variants or indeed in its old classical variant. But they often have very similar, very compatible mechanisms for the magazine. You also need to get yourself familiar with the type of bullet, the type of round that's in this. It's a bigger, larger caliber bullet. So if you're thinking of things like concealment or cover, what you can hide behind when one of these is firing at you needs to be substantially more robust than many other types of tool. So, you know, you might think you're safe with modern brick walls, but most brick walls are composite. There's gaps in the middle, it will punch through. Do I need to get behind a solid block of granite? Do I need to get behind a solid tree? What will stop or slow a bullet from this and what won't? You need to be aware of those things. You need to be aware of how many bursts will typically go off when this is on full auto. So, you know, you're looking between 10 and 12 as an average. So relatively disciplined dispersal of rounds here, that's what you're looking for. You need to be able to listen with tools like this too. Because if you're in cover and you hear this, you know that a round has been loaded. If you hear this, you know that one has exited. If you're listening out for this, you know you've got perhaps 3 to 4 seconds to rush at that person. So again, the sounds are very, very important. The anatomy of it, what removes the round, what takes, how do we eject that from the chamber? That's a very important feature. But predominantly it's getting used to this weapon. So it's getting used to what it does, how it works, what it fires, and understanding that it's a very ubiquitous tool. So again, you know, this is an area I'm devoting a lot more study to, but it's important to get familiar with the different types and archetypes. So I would say, to round off, if you're looking to devote yourself to training for and against very common types of weapons of crime and terror, I would advise Utility knife, understand what it is, how it works, how it's different. Closing knife, so a knife like this, how they work, how they operate, what they can and what they can't do. Carving knife, long fixed blade, how they're used, watching out for bindings, thinking of the difference in penetration and damage these two can do. There are different approaches that you might want to take depending on the type of weapon. Mixing up your blunt weapon awareness to things that are more tool orientated, crowbars, hammers, or things that are more top weighted, such as bats, as opposed to things that are more stick orientated. And if you are looking at firearms and you're not based in the US, or if you're looking to travel abroad, or you're going to areas that might have some substantial risk, how does an AK platform operate? What are the anatomy of an AK platform? What is cover and concealment in relation to the round type held in an AK platform? Again, these are all things to think about, be aware of,